Okay, let's get going. Welcome to today's talk. My name is Christopher Wilton Steer. I'm the head of communications at the Aga Khan Foundation in the UK. As you'll be aware, today's talk is entitled Traveling the Silk Road from East to West, How a 14th Century Mongol Pilgrim Became the Leader of the Church in Iraq. This talk is part of a series complementing the Aga Khan Foundation's current outdoor exhibition in Granary Square, King's Cross, entitled The Silk Road, A Living History. Today's talk by Professor Philip Wood examines the lives of Barsauma and Mark, Christian pilgrims from Mongolia who became important players in the politics of 14th century Iraq. Professor Wood will explore the conditions under which long-distance overland travel and the spread of ideas and personnel across Eurasia was possible during this period. He will also discuss some of the unusual diplomatic links between the East and West and highlight how Christianity in the 14th century was not only a European phenomenon. Philip Wood is Professor of History at the Aga Khan University's Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilisations in London. He is the author of Chronicle of Siyat, Christian Historical Imagination in Late Antique Iraq from 2013, and has recently published The Imam of the Christians, The World of Dionysius of Tel Mare, 750 to 850 with Princeton University Press. Before I hand over to Philip for a talk that will last around 40 minutes, please note that this session is being recorded and will be available via Aga Khan University's and AKF, Aga Khan Foundation's digital channels in the coming days. Philip's talk will be followed by a Q&A. So as questions arise, please type them into the chat box, which you should see here, so that we are ready to go as soon as the Q&A commences. Please also feel free to leave comments. Philip, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Christopher, and good afternoon and good morning to you all. I'm going to share my screen now. So this talk is entitled From East to West on the Silk Road, to Christian Pilgrims in the 14th Century. When we think of the Silk Road, we often think of the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who traveled all the way from Italy to China, where he met the Mongol Emperor Kubla Khan. Now, Marco Polo was only one of a number of European travelers who left accounts of their travels across the Silk Road, who recorded the customs of the people that they met, the goods that they traded in, and the religions that they practiced. And many, such as Polo, come across as fascinated by the strange worlds that they encountered and the fantastical stories they heard from fellow travelers. But what I think we sometimes forget is that this fascination went in two directions. The Mongol Empire facilitated relatively secure travel across Eurasia. It suppressed banditry, it maintained roads and way stations, and it fostered connections that supplied food and beasts of burden to settlements across the route. This route wasn't only maintained to transport armies, though it did have that role, but also because it allowed high-value trade, and it allowed the state to tax the revenues that came from that trade, and it allowed the state to gain good information about distant lands. So in this talk, and this is a picture of the Emperor Kubla Khan, who's a contemporary of many of the figures I'm going to be talking about. In this talk, I'd like to emphasize the way that the Mongol Empire related to non-state institutions, which also sought to use the Silk Road to their advantage. And I'm going to concentrate on two near contemporaries of Marco Polo, that is, of two Christian monks, Barsauma and Mark, who came from the inner lands of the Mongol Empire and who traveled west across Turkestan to visit Iraq, Byzantium, and Western Europe. Unlike Marco Polo, both men eventually settled in their destination, and Mark himself went on to be elected Patriarch, the highest office of the Church of the East in Iraq. Now, before we look at the careers of Mark and Barsauma more closely, I'd like to set out a little bit of the context in which they lived. Their religious context, that is the presence of Christianity across Asia before European colonization, and secondly, the political context of the Mongol Empire. Now, we often associate Christianity with Europe. Europe is the home of the Vatican City, the cradle of the Reformation. Many European states have presented themselves as successors to the Roman Empire, which was probably the first Christian state, and which played a major role in organizing councils of bishops who decided Christian doctrine. Now, this is all true, but it's a story that neglects the spread of Christianity beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire, even in the earliest days. Jesus, it was said, had designated apostles to travel to India, to the Caucasus, and to Iran. And from the 3rd century, there are reports of an organized church in the Sasanian Empire in what's now Iran and Iraq. And that's what I've shown you on the map here. And I think the map shows you quite how large the Sasanian world was in comparison to the Roman Empire. The church in the Sasanian world wasn't an established church. It wasn't the official religion of Sasanian Persia. And it was subjected to periodic persecution. But it also experienced substantial growth across the centuries. And while Greek was a principal Christian language of the Eastern Mediterranean, deeper into Syria and Mesopotamia and further east, this role was taken by Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic. And it was in Syriac that theologians in the Sasanian world celebrated the liturgy, composed theology, and recorded history. It's a strand of the history of Christianity that's often missing from education in Europe. But Syriac-speaking Christians were preeminent in many church confessions, especially in the Church of the East, which is the dominant church of the Sasanian Empire. And it was a church that was increasingly recognized by the Shah himself. Now, the appearance of Islam in the 7th century didn't spell the end for the Church of the East. On the contrary, membership of a much larger empire, which combined the richest provinces of both the Romans and the Sasanians, that is, Syria and Egypt and Iraq, were extremely beneficial to merchants based in the new caliphate, and these included Christians. So when merchants from the Persian Gulf negotiated for trading rights in southern India, Christians were among their number. And it was in this period that Christianity, so this is a bronze plate, a copper plate made out to Christian and other West Asian traders in the South Indian city of Kollam in the 9th century. And on the right, there are 2 figures, probably mythical figures, who founded the Christian church in southern India. This is Mar Shapur and Mar Prod, and their titles are given there in Syriac. So that was this is the maritime trade that stimulated towards the Abbasid Caliphate. It was in the same period that Christians reached China. And from the late 7th century, we have a rock stele cut near the Tang capital of Chang'an in both Chinese and Syriac, which describes Christianity as the Persian religion and describes it in terms that would be familiar to Chinese Buddhists. It describes Christ as the Buddha of light. Perhaps one of the best indications of the distribution of the Church of the East is shown by the widespread ordination of its bishops. By the end of the 8th century, bishops were being ordained for Nishapur in Khorasan, modern Iran, for Merv in modern Turkmenistan, for Samarkand in modern Uzbekistan, for Tibet, and for China. So when we think about Christianity in this period, it would probably be fair to say that over half of the world's Christians lived east of Constantinople, i.e. outside Europe. Moreover, a great many of these lived under the rule of Muslims rather than the rule of Christians. And that Muslims at this point, the 8th and 9th centuries, were often a small urban minority ruling over much larger numbers of Christians and Zoroastrians. But if the church benefited from transcontinental links, it was also very vulnerable to changes in political systems. And the 10th century saw the disintegration of the caliphate as a unified political force and the persecution of Christians in China. Bishoprics in China and Tibet were probably abandoned in this period. But they lived on in Central Asia, and Christian missionaries and educational institutions continued to play a role in the Central Asian region. For instance, both the Uyghur and Mongolian languages came to be written down in scripts derived from Syriac, and several Mongol or Turkic tribes, such as the Naiman and the Kerait and the Ungut, converted to Christianity, at least in part. All of these tribes will continue to be central members of the confederation created by Chinggis Khan. And the two figures we're talking about today were respectively, Barsauma and Mark were respectively a Uyghur and an Ungut, and were members of the Eastern Turkic and Mongolian peoples who were located very close in terms of marriage alliances and political affiliation to the tribe of the great Khan himself. Now, the Mongols had created their vast empire in the generation before the events I'm going to describe here today. Temujin, the Mongol leader known to posterity as Chinggis Khan, had united the peoples of Mongolia and Manchuria before sweeping towards northern and eastern China to incorporate the states of Jin and Xixia. So I've got these on a map. So the Jin and Xixia are the Chinese states, the western and northern Chinese states that are conquered by the Mongols. And soon afterwards, Chinggis would go on to incorporate Central Asia in his domains as well, the kingdoms of the Karakitai and the Khwarazm Shah. So those are that's the initial expansion of the Mongol Empire. And his successors would expand Mongol rule even further to destroy the caliphate in Baghdad, in Iraq, to drive Mongol boundaries even on to into Syria. And they'd also drive further south into China and conquer the southern Song dynasty. And the Mongols replaced the Song with a new dynasty and referred to themselves as the Yuan. And these conquered territories were divided into 4 khanates. The greatest of these was the great Khan himself, who ruled both as a Mongol emperor and as the Yuan emperor of China. And then we have further west, the Chagatai Khan in Central Asia, the Il Khan ruling over Iraq and Iran, and the Khan of the Golden Horde. So these are the 4 khanates of the Mongol Empire. And I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about the Il Khanate. The campaigns of Chinggis were famous for their brutality against any city that resisted their advance. And the Mongols' treatment of Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and Baghdad were infamous. But the Mongol Empire also allowed new opportunities to men of talent who would cooperate with them. And they were willing to grant high offices to men of non-Mongol background, whatever their religion, whether they be Muslim or Buddhist or Christian, animist. This relative tolerance of the Mongol court with regard to religion was a striking feature to European observers at this time, who sometimes depicted the Tartars, the Mongols in this context, as natural philosophers who were willing to entertain all possible religious truths. As we will see, both Christians and Muslims were periodically successful in converting Mongol rulers to their faith, though this seemed to have had little effect in preventing Mongols from pursuing war against their neighbors, including the Mamluk sultans in Egypt. The story of Barsauma and Mark is preserved in a Syriac saint's life from the 14th century, and it's almost certainly a translation from Persian. It is a hagiography, a saint's life. It aims to celebrate the lives of these 2 holy men. When I talk about this story, when we hear about this story, we should hear it with that caveat in mind. It doesn't aspire to 19th or 20th century ideas of historical objectivity. But that said, I think a lot of these reports have the ring of truth. Barsauma, who's the older of these two men was probably a Uyghur. Was probably one of the Turkic tribes that were closely allied to the Mongols. His parents, Shiban and Kayamta, endured a long period of childlessness. But after a lot of patience and prayer, Kayamta gave birth to a son, and she gave him the Syriac name, Barsauma, which means son of the fast. It might have seemed a fitting name for a child who was born in response to repeated prayer. But also, and I think this bears stressing, it was the name of several Syriac-speaking holy men. It was a name with specifically Christian resonance. To his parents' surprise, Barsauma refused to be married when he came of age, and instead he declared his wish to become a monk. At the age of 23, he traveled to Khan Balik, which is very near to the modern city of Beijing, and received Christian monastic orders. He became very famous for his ascetical devotion, and after many years, he acquired a disciple named Mark, who was a member of the Tangut tribe, who came from the city of Kwashang, which lies in modern-day Inner Mongolia. And Mark was also made a monk at the hands of the Metropolitan Archbishop of near Beijing called Nestorius. After many years of living as monks in what's now Chinese Inner Mongolia, they decided to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to see the Holy Sepulchre. And they told their fellow monks, it would be exceedingly helpful if we left this region and set out for the West, for we could visit the tombs of the Holy Martyrs and the Catholic Fathers and be blessed by them. And if Christ, the Lord of the universe, blesses us and sustains our lives, we could visit Jerusalem and receive complete pardon for all of our sins and offences. Now that's what the hagiography tells us. It also seems from what we're going to see later that their journey was approved at the very highest political levels. So it may be that they also had some kind of ambassadorial role, or at least it was hoped that they'd gather information that would be useful to the great Khan. Now, to travel safely across such large distances required a travel permit, and they duly received this from the emperor at his court at Khan Balik. Now, many times during their journey, they'd have to petition Mongol rulers for similar documents so that they could travel safely and avoid arrest as spies. And this phenomenon of travel documentation is a good reminder that these wide connections across the continent were only made available to people with good political connections. And the fact that both Barsauma and Mark belonged to ethnic groups that were very close to the great Khan must have been crucial to making this kind of long-distance voyage possible. Even then, their success was still dependent on the ebbs and flows of the different Khans' political authority. And there are a number of occasions in Central Asia and the Middle East where they were held up because of rebellion or banditry. Their first stop on the journey was to visit the city of Kwashang in Inner Mongolia, which was Mark's birthplace, his home city. Here they were received by Mark's relatives and the Mongol prince Khan Boga. This local ruler insisted that they take a large quantity of baggage animals and gifts for the cities that they passed through. And they rather naively insisted that such things would not be necessary. But their host pointed out that they'd never undertaken such a significant journey before, and that they'd come underprepared. At any rate, the host said that if they didn't need such extensive gifts or a baggage train, they could always dispose of it by giving it to the poor in the Holy Land. And as it happened, the advice of Khan Boga was very wise, and Barsauma and Mark were obliged to give away all of their possessions to smooth relations with the rulers of the cities that they passed through. Next, they reached the cities of Tangut, which are known in Chinese as Xia, the Western lands. These cities were culturally Tibetan, and they'd been periodically under the control of both China and Tibet, as well as enjoying periods of political independence, before being incorporated into the Mongol Empire in the first conquests of Chinggis Khan. This area was heavily Buddhist, but it doesn't seem to have prompted any kind of negative comment from our author, who doesn't seem to have viewed Buddhists as a political rival or seen their religious beliefs as idolatrous. From here, they came to the city of Khotan, which produced one of the easternmost Iranian languages and was another important Buddhist center. And then they went on to Kashgar in what's now Chinese Xinjiang. Marco Polo had reported that the prosperity of Kashgar and noted that it was famous for its production of jade. But our travelers found a city that had been ravaged by war during a rebellion, and the famines that followed it forced them to rely on their own provisions. So this huge baggage train that they were obliged to take with them came in useful. They were also obliged to spend a long time in Kashgar trying to obtain a new travel document from the rebel prince Ogadai. And the difficulties that they encountered here underscore the fact that the advantages of the Pax Mongolica were extremely fragile, and the potential for travel across the continent was subject both to the favor of rulers and the stability of their rule. Barsauma and Mark lost many of their possessions at Kashgar, but they were lucky enough to receive hospitality at a monastery of the Church of the East in eastern Iran near the city of Tus in Khorasan. They would have passed through the cities of Konya or Gench on their way, which is the lands of the Khwarizm Shah, the Muslim ruler who'd been defeated by Chinggis Khan. And here I'm grateful to Christopher for letting me use one of his photos of this site in eastern Turkmenistan. From Iran, the travelers passed on to Azerbaijan, to the city of Mar Aga, which had been recently founded by the Mongol ruler of Iran, the Ilkhan. And here, it was here in the city of Mar Aga, that they met the patriarch of the Church of the East. The fact that they were being given audiences with high-ranking Mongol princes and the leaders of churches are indications of what impressive political connections these men have. And the patriarch, Mardenha, approved them on their wish to visit the city of Baghdad and venerate Christian shrines there before they continued on their way to Palestine. He tells them, "My sons, the angel of providence shall protect you on this difficult journey. Do not let your toil make you sad, for the prophet said that those who sow in tears shall reap in joy." They took their leave of Denha from Mar Aga and they proceeded through northern Iraq, through Erbil, an ancient city that had grown wealthy from the cotton trade, through Sinjar and Mosul. So this is a nice 19th century photo of Mosul, of a mosque that's very sadly recently been destroyed by ISIS. And here they visited shrines dedicated to famous Christian monks from the 4th century, the monk Mar Augin, whose disciples were said to have spread Christianity throughout the Sasanian Empire. And though hardly anyone in modern European churches has heard of Mar Augin, his fame in Iraq was so great that he was known as the second Christ at this time. The travelers initially decided to carry on living as monks once they reached Iraq. So they're now in an environment where there are lots of fellow Christians, and they decide to return to the monastic life that they'd enjoyed in China. So they bought a cell at a monastery near Mosul called Tar El, but they could only live here as hermits for a little while before they were summoned again to the patriarch Denha. And Denha told them essentially that their unusual skills made them too important to the church to allow them to simply retreat to a monastery. Denha insisted that they acquire a document from the Ilkhan in order to confirm his own enthronement as patriarch. And Denha needed this because he wanted such a document to allow him to gather taxes from his co-religionists, from fellow Christians, so that Denha could then afford to repair church buildings. And Denha seems to have felt that as members of, as a Uyghur and as an Ungut, so as members of a tribe that's very closely related to the Mongols, they would have a familiarity with the language and ceremonies of the court of the Ilkhan, which would then allow them to acquire this document without any diplomatic mishap. And Denha was correct in this estimation. They very swiftly received the document from the Ilkhan. After performing this service for Denha, Barsauma and Mark then decided to press on in their attempts to reach Jerusalem. But sadly, they were unsuccessful. The roads from Mosul to Aleppo were blocked by bandits, and their plans to travel via the Caucasus to the sea, through Turkey, through Cilicia, and then take a boat to Palestine were also brought to nothing because of endemic fighting in eastern Anatolia. So in this period, at least through the eyes of this author, the northern part of the Middle East comes across as exceedingly difficult for travel. And unfortunately for our travelers, it meant that they were never able to complete their journey to Jerusalem. Barsauma and Mark then returned to Iraq, and then for a third time, they are summoned to meet the Patriarch Denha. I suspect that Denha may have realized quite how useful two Mongol Christian monks were to the Church of the East, given the importance of good relations with Mongol authorities in Iraq, Central Asia, and China. Denha unexpectedly announced the promotion of Mark as the new Metropolitan Archbishop of what the text calls Kati Waong. It's probably a Syriac rendering of the word Cathay, Cathay being the name for northern China in some of the Turkic languages that were commonly used by the Mongols for administration. Denha informed Mark that he'd require a new name to honor his consecration as bishop. And Mark picked a name at random by lot. And from that moment on, he was known by the Syriac name of Yab Allaha, the gift of God. I'm going to carry on referring to him as Mark in this lecture, just for simplicity's sake. Barsauma and Mark prepared to set off back home to the east because of Mark's election as bishop. But again, they were delayed by political circumstances, and they found they couldn't cross the river Oxus because of ongoing rebellions in Central Asia. And as a result, they were obliged to remain in their monastic cell at Tar El near Mosul. But other bishops seem to have clearly felt the same way as Denha about having Mongol Christians in places of importance. And when Denha himself died suddenly, the Assembly of Bishops and the Christian laymen of Baghdad decided that Mark, Yabalaha, should succeed Denha as patriarch of the whole of the church. So this is a spectacular promotion for a young man. Mark objected that he wasn't at all learned in the traditions of the church and that he didn't even know Syriac, which was the main language of liturgy and scholarship. But this was not considered to be an insurmountable obstacle, and he traveled to meet the Ilkhan in Azerbaijan. And here he received a series of special objects to show that he enjoyed the Ilkhan's favor and had been confirmed in his office as patriarch. And these were a silk Mongol robe, a parasol, an umbrella, and a golden paisa, which is a metal lozenge inscribed in Mongol and sometimes in Chinese. This is a paisa, a surviving example of a paisa, that stated his right to tax Christians to pay for the upkeep and construction of churches. So it is a sort of badge of office. It's worth pausing a moment to reflect on the importance of these gifts. The fact that it was necessary to use objects does point to the possibility of fraud. That is, this is an environment where other clergy might claim to have been elected and set up themselves as anti-patriarchs. Second, this paisa was no mere empty honor. It was originally given to members of the Mongol royal family and allowed them to confiscate property from anyone in the realms of the Khan. So the gift of the paisa to Mark, at least in theory, was a sign that he'd been lent the autocratic powers of the Khan himself. And thirdly, though the objects used here were distinctively Mongol or Chinese, we can observe a number of parallels between the recognition of the patriarch by the Khan and earlier examples, where the patriarch had been recognized by the Abbasid Caliph in the 8th and 9th century, or by his representative, and then permitted to carry the caliph's diploma or to wear a biruna, the patriarch's cap. So in terms of the wider context for these gifts, the Christians of the Middle East had long evolved a symbiotic relationship with autocratic governments, both regional and further afield. And they depended on these relationships to protect their community from violence from non-Christian neighbors, but also to endorse the authority of the patriarch from rivals among his fellow Christians. And we can still observe these mechanisms here, except that Mark's Mongol background gave him very distinctive advantages which weren't available to clerics born in Iraq or Iran. Mark's unexpected promotion was accompanied by a second promotion, this time for his mentor Barsauma. And this time it was undertaken not by the Christian population, but by the Ilkhan, by the Mongol ruler. The Mongol ruler at this time was one Argon, who was a devout Christian, or according to some sources is seen as a devout Christian, though there's no actual record of his baptism. At the very least, we could say that Argon was deeply concerned with opposing Muslims in Palestine, and he was interested in developing an alliance with Christian states in the Mediterranean, both the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople and the Latin states of Western Europe. Now, these events occurred, this hope for an alliance occurred not long after the destruction of much of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, through which Western Europeans had long maintained an important foothold in Palestine and the Levant. So the possibility of Christian control of the Holy Land was a recent memory, and the plan for a renewed crusade, both by Latin Europeans, Byzantines, and by Mongols, was made more plausible by the existence of a pro-Christian Ilkhan who ruled much of Iran and Iraq. Now this time, Mark was left in Baghdad to act as patriarch, and Barsauma travelled alone, and he boarded a ship on the Black Sea bound for Constantinople. And here he was received by the Emperor Andronicus II and went on a tour of the city. This is an image of Andronicus from a contemporary illuminated manuscript. Constantinople had at one time been one of the largest settlements in Western Eurasia, and it still possessed the enormous land walls which would protect it from assault for more than a century. Constantinople had fallen to the Latin Crusaders in the Fourth Crusade of 1204, but our narrator makes no comment on this dramatic history of Christian disunity or upon the city's classical remains. Instead, our narrator's interest is really focused on the collection of saintly relics held in the city, and on the links to on the links that these afforded to the biblical past and the patristic past. So he passes comment on the head of the theologian John Chrysostom, which he sees in a church. He sees the stone on which the Virgin Mary wept at the crucifixion, and the relics of Lazarus, the man whom Jesus had raised from the dead. It's these relics that really hold pride of place in his own account. So I suspect that all sorts of diplomatic overtures occurred, which were given by Barsauma to Andronicus on behalf of the Khan. But this hasn't been the primary concern of our hagiographer, who's been chiefly interested in telling us about the relics contained in Constantinople. So I think the text doesn't really spell out the diplomatic significance of all of the meetings that Barsauma enjoys. From Constantinople, Barsauma sailed to Naples, and en route he witnessed a volcanic eruption, which may have been Vesuvius or Etna, and he also saw a naval battle in the Bay of Sorrento. He passes the comment that he was very surprised that Europeans didn't engage in the wanton slaughter of civilians, which was common practice in Mongol warfare. From Naples, he travelled by road to Rome, where he was received by the cardinals. Now, he'd intended to present the Ilkhan's proposals for a crusade to the Pope Honorius IV, but he found that the Pope had recently died and that the cardinals were unwilling to take a decision which might bind his successor. The cardinals were also initially suspicious of Barsauma's claims to be an Orthodox Christian, and they interrogated him on his creed and on what his religious beliefs were. So we should remember that there were many different Christian confessions at this time, some of whom had very deep theological disagreements. So that's really part of the background of why the cardinals are quizzing Barsauma on his religious beliefs. Barsauma gave brief answers that the cardinals seemed to have found satisfactory. But Barsauma stressed that he hadn't come to discuss theology, but a political alliance. And the narrator relates that they were very impressed when he told them about the extent of Christianity in the Mongol Empire, especially when he told them that many of the children of the Mongol king had been baptized and that many of his subjects have followed suit and that new churches were being built now in Iraq. As in Constantinople, in Rome, the hagiographer tells us that Barsauma was much more impressed by Christian relics than in classical ruins or in recent construction. So here Barsauma saw the throne of St. Peter in the Vatican, the head of Stephen, the first martyr, and the body of Matthew, the apostle. But Barsauma had no desire to kick his heels in Rome to wait for the cardinals to elect a new pope, and he spent his time around a year travelling within Europe. He went to visit Genoa, where he saw the body of John the Baptist, and Paris, where he was very impressed by the relics which had been seized from Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade, and by the training of scholars in the university there, and he even celebrated Mass for the King Philip IV. A year later, the cardinals had elected Nicholas IV as Pope, so here's his tomb. And Nicholas received the message of the Ilkhan very sympathetically and allowed Barsauma to take back some small relics with him as a gift for the Ilkhan. Barsauma spent Holy Week, the week before Easter, within Rome, and he was very impressed by the ceremony of the Vatican for Palm Sunday and Good Friday. So by some measures, Barsauma's mission was a great success. He'd confirmed the common objective of the Ilkhan, the Pope, and the King of France for a renewed crusade in circumstances that, to many perspectives, seemed much more favourable than the crusades of the 13th century. The cardinals in Rome had confirmed Barsauma's orthodoxy, and the gift of relics seemed to cement these good intentions. The Ilkhan was delighted with Barsauma's mission, so much so that he constructed a new church for him next to the Khan's own tent, where he could house the relics brought back from the West, and where the Khan's own son, Kharbande, received baptism with the name Nicholas. It's no coincidence, I think, that the name selected was the name of the Pope at the same time. Our narrator comments that the good news of the gospel of the kingdom of heaven spread throughout the world. Barsauma died not long after his return to Iraq, without ever returning to the land of his birth. But what about his disciple Mark, who was now installed as the patriarch of a church which spread from Anatolia and Cyprus to northern China? Now, not long after the Ilkhan Argon, who was the Ilkhan who sponsored Barsauma's journey, after Argon had celebrated the baptism of his son, Argon died, and he was succeeded by his cousin Kaikhator. Now, Kaikhator was described as strictly neutral in matters of religion. He gave equal consideration to Jews, Muslims, Christians, and pagans, a term which may include Buddhists in this context. And it's under Kaikhator's reign that a new church was built in Maraga, dedicated to the Saint Marmari, the legendary apostle of Babylonia, and also to George, the famous soldier saint who was venerated from the Caucasus to England. This new church housed many famous relics, including those of Stephen and the soldier saint Demetrius. Many villages were donated to the church to provide tax-free income. And interestingly, the narrator uses the Arabic term waqf to describe this endowment. It's a term that's normally used for endowments to mosques. But despite all the promise of Mark's election, with its expectation of influence at court and lavish donations to the church, the rest of Mark's reign was unfortunately a litany of disaster and of the mistreatment of Christians at the hand of their Muslim neighbours and of Ilkhans who started to convert to Islam. At one point, Muslim raiders ransacked the cell in the patriarch's own monastery. They suspended Mark naked from the ceiling of his cell and beat him with sticks in an effort to make him convert to Islam. They knocked down the church that had recently been built in Maraga, dug up the grave of the patriarch Denha, and built a mosque in its place. Later on, the narrative gives lengthy accounts of the fighting that went on in the citadel of Arbela, modern Erbil, in northern Iraq, where the population of this mostly Christian city and Mongol troops were besieged by local Muslim forces. The siege eventually ended in tragedy when Mark, who believed the promises of the believing general, persuaded the Christians to lay down their arms in exchange for safe passage. But the besiegers tricked them. They slaughtered all of the men and seized the women and children as slaves. The denouement of the war was the restoration of a poll tax over the Christians and the parade of leading notables from Arbela through the streets of Baghdad wearing girdles like beasts of burden. Now, it's worth placing these scenes of bloodshed into the longer context of Christian-Muslim relations. The Mongols ruled over a society in Iraq where Christians and Muslims had long coexisted. This coexistence should not be idealized. It was a coexistence that had its own rules, and it was predicated on a socio-religious hierarchy in which Muslims were at the summit. Only Muslims could bear arms. Muslims were worth twice the value of Christians when it came to paying blood money or testifying in courts. Christians were unable to ride horses. They were made to wear distinctive clothes, including girdles. And male Christians were subject to a poll tax, a jizya, which was a very substantial burden on many families, especially in times when harvests failed, and it was considered to be an important motivation for conversions to Islam. But to observe that this legislation was discriminatory or would be unthinkable in 21st century democratic state would be beside the point. I would stress that it still allowed for a kind of equilibrium. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and parts of Iraq were probably Christian majorities until the 12th to 14th centuries, with the tipping point coming at different points in different places. Discriminatory legislation and the disarming of the Christian majority meant that it was possible for Muslims and Muslim rulers to tolerate large Christian populations without feeling threatened by them. This situation had changed with the Mongol conquest, which eliminated many of the symbols of Muslim predominance, especially with the removal of the Abbasid Caliph, who was then still a puppet ruler in Baghdad and notionally ruled the entire Muslim world. The destruction of these ancient Muslim symbols was especially shocking because Muslim political dominance and the conquest that had established it in the 7th century were seen as proofs of the truth of Islam in face of the claims of other religions. What is more, the prospect of several Ilkhans considering conversion to Christianity and publicly favouring churchmen such as Denha and Mark suddenly made the presence of large numbers of Christians extremely threatening. Though our narrator does not dwell on it, the wife of one earlier Ilkhan had had a number of prominent mosques destroyed, and several Ilkhans had removed the discriminatory legislation that Christians had been subjected to. In particular, they'd exempted Christians from the poll tax. So they'd removed the religious basis of taxation. After the capture of Baghdad by the Mongols, the general Hulagu had given the caliph's palace as a present to the patriarch of the Church of the East, and the Ilkhans actively planned to fight Muslim opponents in Egypt and Syria. The Ilkhan Argon's proposed alliance with the Latins never came to fruition, but his predecessor Abaka had launched an attack on Mamluk Egypt together with Christian allies from Georgia and Armenia. So it's against this context that I think the reimposition of a poll tax and the parading of Christian leaders with the girdle was a marked demonstration that a familiar hierarchy in which Muslims were on top had now been restored. And it was probably from this moment until the middle of the 14th century that we begin to see this contraction of Christianity in Iraq, which would restrict it to small towns and villages in the mountains of the north. It's a process, I think, that we can trace through the disappearance of bishoprics in the lists of bishops that are given in chronicles. So to conclude, the Mongol Empire fostered new links between far-flung territories. The careers of Barsauma and Mark have shown us that all sorts of unexpected connections of a text translated from Persian into Syriac, of Mongols who belonged to a Syriac-speaking church, of an Ilkhan who sent emissaries to Constantinople and the Vatican, of pilgrims to Jerusalem who went instead to venerate Christian holy places in Baghdad and imported Christian relics to Azerbaijan. It's a text that doesn't just speak of the 14th century and the lives of its two monastic adventurers, but it also evokes a broader context in which Christian missionaries traveled the Silk Road from Iraq to China in earlier centuries as well, when Baghdad had been linked to the Tangut in Chang'an in the 8th and 9th centuries, and when churchmen in Iraq had established bishoprics for Samarkand and Tibet. The tale we have heard is one of unexpected endings too, of pilgrims who became a patriarch and an ambassador without apparently wanting the jobs or apparently being qualified for them. These promotions can be read as signs of the enormous cachet of a Mongol background in this suddenly united world. That said, it's also a tale of disappointments. The pilgrimage that Mark and Barsauma had planned to Jerusalem was never completed, The crusade that Argon had hoped to arrange with the Latins never materialized, despite many fine words. And in spite of the favor in which Denha and Mark were held by the Ilkhan, the Christian community in Iraq would face a devastation from which it would never recover. If there is a simple conclusion to the story, it may be that connections across the continent of Eurasia that this story celebrates were often dependent on single individuals in autocratic societies, and that when these men died or changed their minds, this could cause the plans of a great many lesser mortals to collapse or unravel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was a rip-roaring ride, fascinating journey, and a lesser-known one along the Silk Road. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure our many attendees did too. So let's jump to some Q&A. I'm just going to get one in there nice and early, just to talk. You spoke a lot about the overland routes during that period, and I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the maritime trade routes, how active they were, and whether these Christianity was traveling along these routes as well.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. Yes, so the slide that I showed you right at the start with the column plates is a good example of how West Asians of many different religious backgrounds benefited from the trading connections created by the Abbasid Empire. And I think that the Abbasids were such an economic powerhouse because they combined the territories of both Persia and Rome, the richest territories, and created a kind of a new economic hub, and it draws in trade from all around the world, from East Africa and from South Asia as well. And I think that's one of the things that give these West Asians this clout. They can demand trading concessions from Indian kings. And what's fascinating about the column plates is we have signatures from the different parts of the trading association. Some are Muslims signing in Arabic, some are Zoroastrians and Christians signing in Middle Persian, and some are Jews signing in Judeo-Persian. So I think the Abbasid world gives all sorts of opportunities to people of all different religions. Again, we can say that without presenting it as some kind of multicultural utopia. It was certainly a world where there's an official inequality, but the economic expansion is something that lots of different people can benefit from. So yes, there are also maritime connections, and in the cities of southern China, you see Muslim and Christian and Jewish populations come as traders, and these are discussed in Arabic texts at the time. Great,
thank you. So we have a question here from A. Manieli. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It says, I think you remarked that the Archbishop at Khan Balik was named Nestorius. Was he or they Christians there following Nestorian rites?
Yes, so the Church of the East is sometimes referred to as the Nestorian Church. In recent times, in the last 10 or 20 years, that's become a more controversial term in scholarship. So people today tend to use the term Church of the East. That's partly because the theology of Nestorius wasn't clearly followed in the church, at least until the 7th or 8th centuries. And intellectuals in the church would often say things like, our church was not founded by Nestorius. Nestorius was a Greek. On the other hand, they would say that Nestorius had they would agree with a lot of what is in texts attributed to Nestorius. So without going into the theological complexities, yes, it is it's a church commonly known as the Nestorian Church.
Wonderful, thank you. A question from Munira Shaheen. Professor Wood, is there reference to exchange of goods or interaction with kings of Tangut, now Hunza?
Hi, Munira. Thanks for the question. No, in my text, I don't see any overland, any remarks for overland connections into Hunza. That might reflect their Christian perspectives. So it may be that Christians in particular are invested into this Iraq, Iran, Central Asia, China route. And there may be that if you were looking at texts from other traditions, such as a Buddhist tradition, you would see these links into South Asia overland. But in my text, we don't see that.
Thank you. One from Mohammed Banji. Do Marco Polo, sorry, I hope you have the answer to this one. Do Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, and Zheng He tell a consistent story of their travels along the Silk Road?
Well, what a question. My instinct is to say no. I would say all Silk Road travelers are extremely idiosyncratic in their reporting. I'm afraid I'm both too ignorant to answer your question properly, and I think it would be there are several lectures to answer that question. But I mean, it's if you're interested, I think there's a good research project in there.
Tell us about some of the confessional differences between Christians on the Silk Road. Were they all members of a single church? I think not, maybe.
No, I mean, so firstly, I would say that Iraq is probably the most religiously diverse place in the hostage to fortune. I think probably Iraq is one of the most religiously diverse places in the world at that time. What's more, there are very many different Christian confessions, only some of whom would recognize the others as Christians. So there are groups like Manichees and Marcionites who would not be recognized as Christians by other Christians or by Muslims. And Manichees certainly spread right across the Silk Road. So there was a very major discovery of Manichean texts on Silk Road sites, large Manichean temples in southern China, a large Manichean complex discovered in southern Siberia. So Manichees are certainly very widespread in this environment. But in terms of Christians who would recognize one another as Christians, through the Silk Road, you've got the Melkites, who are, you could say, Greek Orthodox, even though they would use, they might use Greek in the liturgy, but they might use other languages spoken, and may well use Arabic or other languages. And then you've also got the Jacobites, or what are now known as the Syrian Orthodox, who are another church that uses Syriac. In Christological terms, they are a Miaphysite church. And then you've also got the Church of the East. The Church of the East is the largest of these, and it's certainly the only Christian confession that has a major presence in China, at least until the Catholics start their own mission there. And one of the, I guess, the unintended consequences of these overtures from the Mongol Khan to the Catholics is that they become very aware of the presence of Christians in China. And instead of stimulating a crusade, it stimulates a kind of counter mission where some Catholics start setting themselves up in competition with the Nestorian, with the Church of the East in major sites in northern China.
Great, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. Thank you. I have a question here, perhaps a follow-up from Dr. Khurshid Sana Khan. Do you think that mass conversion to Islam in Iraq could also be explained on other grounds?
I would say the timing fits. I think there is a major role for that. I think there's a major political stimulus for mass conversion to Islam in Iraq. The timing fits very well with the with a kind of Muslim backlash against Christians because of how Christians have been supported and how Muslims have been treated during the Ilkhanate.
Okay, great. I have one here, which is a sort of comment with a bit of a question. So bear with me as I read this out. There is some misunderstanding about the jizya. Am I pronouncing that right, correctly?
Yeah.
Purely religious, from a purely religious point of view, paying the jizya means the protected population is, I think it means exempt from military service and other requirements of Muslim citizens. When Khalid bin Walid conquered Persia, there were Christian Arab troops in his army who were exempt from jizya. Some Muslim rulers misuse jizya, but it's not meant to be burdensome. Could you comment?
Yes, I think, so initially what we have in the 7th century sources is what's called in the papyri a diagraphon, is a poll tax. And in the Marwani period, in the 8th century, that is increasingly framed as a jizya. That is, Quranic language is used to gloss. So the term jizya is used in the Quran, and it's used to gloss. The poll tax. What I would say about the Quran's framing of the jizya is it's intended to be shaming, and there are a number of records from 8th century sources of Christians and Jews being shamed when they pay the jizya. So there's some kind of shaming ritual. So maybe they have to have some kind of girdle around their neck, or they have to be struck by the governor when they pay it, or they pass underneath a bar. So it's associated with inferiority. I would say that yes, sometimes jurists say it's because Christians don't bear arms that they pay the jizya. We see that when Christian Arabs seek to avoid paying the jizya, it's something that they see as shameful. So it's not just a matter of paying less money, it's also about status. They say, can we pay double the zakat instead of the jizya, which both tells us that the jizya is a higher rate than zakat, but it also tells us it's something they seek to avoid the rituals associated with the jizya. It is certainly in later periods, it's seen as something that stimulates conversion. So we know, for instance, from the Cairo Geniza, that Jews have a special charity fund to pay the jizya for poor Jews so that they won't be forced to convert to Islam. And Christian observers say, actually, this is a good idea, maybe we should copy that. So it's clearly seen as a burden.
Okay, thank you. We have time for probably one more from Alex MacDonald. How significant was the Fourth Crusade in shaping these religious developments? Did it catalyze the Byzantine Church of the East to focus on solely expanding eastwards as their Western base was removed / no longer feasible?
Thank you. So it's important to differentiate between, so the churches in the Mediterranean, really, you've got the Western Catholics, so in France and Italy and Spain, and then you've got Greek Orthodoxy, which is based in Constantinople, and they're in communion with the Russians and with the Melkites. So there are churches in communion with the Greek Orthodox who are in Central Asia. So they do have colonies further east, but they are, when I use the term Church of the East, I'm talking about the church that originates in Persia, originates in Iran. So the Church of the East is not a church with any links to Byzantium.
Okay, I think we're at time. I just wanted to thank you so much, Professor Wood, for such a stimulating talk, and to everybody who's come and for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't answer them all. Before you leave, I just wanted to share a little bit more information about what's coming next in the Silk Road program. I hope you can see this screen here. Come in if you can't. So the exhibition, for those in London, this is up until the 14th of June in Granary Square. So really it's the last weekend to see it in Granary Square coming up. And then we're lucky it's moving to Lewis Cubitt Square round the corner until the 1st of September. So it'll be for a bit longer, but in a different location. But I recommend seeing it in Granary Square because it's a great location. Some other talks we have coming up in the series. You can find more information about these on the Silk Road-livinghistory.org website. And in addition, we have some workshops. So if you really want to go deeper into the Silk Road in a creative way and get more interactive with it, we have a partnership with the Prince's Foundation School of Traditional Arts, who are doing some online courses inspired by the Silk Road exhibition and broader program. And so here are some of those coming up, again, more on the Silk Road Living History website. They're online, so you can join from anywhere. And we have a Silk Road Bazaar happening this weekend. So in the Canopy Market next to Granary Square and King's Cross, there is a weekend market, and we're taking over a portion of that to bring you a Silk Road Bazaar with about 12, 13, 14 different vendors who selling artisanal products, homeware, rugs, clothes, all sorts of wonderful stuff, silks from Ottoman-inspired silks and all sorts of lovely things. So I really recommend coming down to see that. You can fit that in with the exhibition. Yes, you can find all of this on the Silk Road-livinghistory.org website. At that point, I'd just like to thank Philip and the Aga Khan University's Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations again, and look forward to welcoming you to the next talk or workshop or the bazaar or the exhibition. Thank you so much again, Philip, and thank you to everyone who came here. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.